Good morning, or good afternoon, or evening, depending on when you are watching this. Welcome to another exciting episode of Social Studies. Now, I'm gonna try to not talk too much because some of this stuff will be covered or already has been covered in class. But this is to help you review it. The more times you hear it, the more likely you are to remember it, and to make sure we get our notes filled in and introduce you to creative notes again. All right, so this is the note sheet we're looking on. Yours might not look quite so pretty because it's all one color, but this is the sheet we are looking at. We started, or we'll start filling this in class. Depending on which class you were in, you may have the first couple of these filled in. That's okay. You can waste a minute or two listening to it again. It won't hurt you. All right, so you should also have this sheet out, please. So you have two sheets, this one and this one. We'll be using them both today. So starting on this one first, you can just set this one aside for now. We're going to be on this one. Starting down the timeline, before 1763, as you remember, most colonists were happy and proud to be British. They loved their king, they loved their mother country, life was good. 1763, I'm sorry, just we need to remember I need to fill in notes here. The first panel is about the Navigation Acts, which we talked about previously. These were laws that restricted trade, and so if you're filling in the blanks, restricted trade by the colonies. They were intended to enforce the British policy of mercantilism. Maybe make a note to yourself what this means. Make mother money, mercantilism. Okay. And the example, Timber Act, etc. This was throughout the 1600s and 1700s. The colonists disliked these laws, but they really weren't enforced too strictly. That's sort of the unofficial British policy of salutary neglect. Salutary, you salute it, it's beneficial. Maybe make a note there. All right. You've seen these before, whether you've read them or not. The Navigation Acts, colonies must trade only for the benefit of the mother country, jolly old England. The Queen thinks it's wonderful, but how do they enforce these laws when the colonies are so far away? And the King says we don't. That would be too hard and expensive. We just sort of let them do their own thing. Everybody benefits. That's salutary neglect. So the trade, which was only supposed to be with England for the most part, lots of people resorted to smuggling, trading with other countries, even though they weren't supposed to. The England didn't worry too much because they were still getting all they needed at cheap prices. So if there was a little bit of cheating going on, it just wasn't worth the enforcement. And this was called salutary neglect. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. French and Indian War is going to change the relationship between the mother country and the colonies. Remember that during the war, Ben Franklin first proposed his unsuccessful plan to unite the colonies for the first time, but they're not ready for that. They would rather die than join. They don't die, though, and eventually they will join. 1763, after the war ends and England, the colonies, and the Iroquois win the war, England wants colonists to help pay the war debts, which is going to lead to some taxation. It's also going to, in order to avoid future wars, the king proclaims in 1763 the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibits, bans, outlaws settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so if you did not get the notes on 1763 panel, and French and Indian War ends, British tried to collect taxes. And then down at the second part, Proclamation of 1763 outlawed settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists disliked the laws. They were often broken. Tensions start to increase a little bit. Maybe make a star or note there. Tensions are starting to increase. All right. The Stamp Act is really going to make the colonists lose their marbles. And that is because they are being asked to pay a tax on paper products. Basically, these are some of the stamps that they had to be taxed to show that the paper was paid. I'm sorry, to show that the tax was paid. The This is the first time colonists are directly taxed. And while people over in England did pay taxes, people in the colonies had not paid taxes directly. There had been tariffs, which are taxes on imports and things like that, but this was the first real direct tax. Even the Sugar Act, which we had talked about previously, that was a tax, but it was more of a tariff than an actual they have to pay out of their own pockets. And because they had to buy these stamps only with British currency, that gets them really upset because not many of them actually had British currency. The colonies all used their own currency, and to require them to pay with British currency meant that that was unaffordable for most. The other thing that's going to really anger the colonists here is that any enforcement, any disputes, if you refuse to pay your tax and you get hauled into court, no longer were these colonial courts, because all of the colonies had their own court system, they were not acceptable for this law. They had to go to a British court, and the only British court in the colonies was up here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the colonies did not like this losing local control. So they're going to really protest. There's going to be riots in the streets, protests everywhere. It's really going to surprise people how angry people get. This is a newspaper at the time, the Pennsylvania Journal and a weekly advertiser, that is going out of business. This is, if you read the whole thing, they are expiring or dying in hopes of a resurrection in life again. And the reason they are dying is because of this dreaded stamp, the Stamp Act that had to be paid. Now, this was not the real Stamp Act, but this was a real stamp on this side. Over here, this is sort of it was a broadside, a poster that was protesting the stamp. It says, an emblem of the effects of the stamp. Oh, the fatal stamp. Fatal means killing. It's saying that this Stamp Act is killing us newspaper printers. Another one was similar. This is the place to affix the stamp. This is saying over our dead bodies. All right, taxation without representation becomes the sort of the rallying cry, which it still is today in DC. We'll talk about that later, but it all boils down to consent. Consent is an important word. Make a note somewhere if you don't know what it means. It basically means to give permission for something to happen. And the idea here is that the colonies believe under the British Constitution, which they believed in the British Constitution, that they could only be taxed if they gave their consent to be taxed. You have to give your consent for a government to tax you. Now, how do you give consent? You can't each person go to the parliament and personally give your consent. Well, the belief was that you give your consent through your representatives in the legislature. Now, today we would say through our representatives in Congress. Back then, it would have been their representatives in Parliament, which is the British legislature. The thing is, however, these colonies had no representation in Parliament, so they were being taxed without representation, which means they could not give consent to this. So they believed these laws, the Stamp Act was unconstitutional under British law. Okay, you should be able to use this to fill in the notes. Tax on newspaper, legal documents, playing cards. Colonist reaction: anger, 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 boycotting, organizing in boycotts. Boycotts we'll talk about down here in 1 second. They're also going to send representatives to New York City, at least 9 of the colonies will, for something called the Stamp Act Congress, which I'll get to in a second as well. They're going to meet and send a petition, which is a protest letter. Lots of vocab words here. And they are also going to boycott British goods. Boycott means refuse to buy. You may have heard of the Montgomery bus boycott when they refused to buy bus service, basically. And they claim this is unfair because it is taxation without representation. And this is because they did not have representation in Parliament, which is the British legislature. Again, if you don't know this, make a note of it. Parliament, British legislature, and a legislature is a group that makes laws. Okay, the next thing we're going to turn to here, this is the Stamp Act Congress. We'll talk about this a little more when you're in school. They are going to issue this declaration, which we will look at in school. Basically, they're protesting that cannot give consent, therefore the tax is illegal. This is going to be the Prime Minister's response, which we will talk about in school. Now, the British are going to send over more soldiers to enforce this act and to put down the riots. There's rioting in the streets, there are protests everywhere. So they send over more British soldiers. And when these soldiers arrive, they are going to need a place to stay. They're going to need food. I mean, they're not ready for all this influx of troops. So they pass a law called the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act. Now, it's good to think of like headquarters. Quarters are the place where you live. Another name for your house, like your quarters. Not quarters as in the coins. These are quarters as in like a place to stay. So the Quartering Act required the colonists to provide food and housing for British soldiers. So if someone comes to your door and says, excuse me, these British soldiers are going to be staying with you for the next 6 months. Take good care of them. And you have to feed them and do their laundry, etc., etc. Now, most people did not want strange soldiers living in their house, so this is going to really upset them as well. So, required colonists to house and feed British soldiers. This is to fill in on your timeline sheet. Colonists' reaction, they protest this violates their basic rights, and tensions rise even more between the colonists and the British soldiers. So you should have all of this first page filled in and just this one here, required colonists to house and feed British soldiers. You do not need to have these three filled in. So only up to 1765. Now, you're going to answer a couple questions, but then you're also going to turn to this. We are going today, you guys are going to work on number 1 and 2 of creative notes. So the first one should talk about the Stamp Act and taxation without representation. Use your notes, use the information in your notes for that. Don't Google it. Don't go to Wikipedia. Don't give me lots of words you don't understand. Keep it simple. Same with the Quartering Act. There's not very much for the Quartering Act that you need to write. You don't need to see that was a mistake about seeing the Townsend Act things. It's right here for you. Okay. You do not need to do numbers 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Not now. Only 1 and 2 right now. Okay. These are some examples I showed you that you're not making these same ones. These were about the French and Indian War, the Albany Plan for Union, and the Proclamation of 1763. What you should do is make sure you put a title up at the top, use shapes, use arrows, use bullets, organize them so they look nice. Not necessarily like this one. Okay, oh, and there's the notes if you happen to miss any of that, at least for that first page. So you can pause and get that if you'd like. This was a little longer than I wanted, but please, please, please do your work. All right, thank you, and have a good day.